All right, today what we are going to focus on is we are going to focus on getting information from the user and using it. And then we have to talk about variables along the way because we're going to need them to store that information that somebody gives us, but also we'll use them throughout the rest of the examples. So let's go ahead and open up a new document. I'm going to go ahead and go to the design view real quick so I can type some of the information out, and then we'll go into the code view and actually implement some of the code. So the first thing I'm going to do real quick, like we did the alert in the last lesson, I'm going to show you another method of the window that you can use to get people to give you information. And it works a lot like the alert. It's going to pop up a window, but instead of just having your message in it, what we're going to do is we're going to be able to have the user fill something in and we can save that. So the method we're going to use is the prompt method. It is a method of the window. So remember there's an understood window dot prompt, and inside the parentheses of the method you're going to have two things, or one of them is required and one of them is optional. So the first the first argument you're going to put in is what you want the pop-up box to ask them for. So we might say something along the lines of, what is your first name? And that's just to tell them what kind of information you are expecting. Now we could end the prompt statement there and it would work fine. If you want to, you can add a second argument to feed into the method, separate it by a comma, and you can say, please enter your name here. And what this attribute does is it takes it and it puts your message in the box that they're actually going to type in. So it's kind of like a text box on the pop-up window that would be pre-filled with please enter your name here. Like I said, that is optional and you can choose to use it or not depending on what you want. Now here's the kicker. With the prompt, when they type something into the prompt and click OK, that information that they typed in has to go somewhere because that prompt goes away. And obviously you're asking for that information for some reason. You don't really just say, hey, what's your name, and never do anything with them. So what we need to do before we go and write our code is we need to talk about variables. Variables are very common in all programming languages, and what they do is they set up temporary storage areas where you can put stuff into the variable and then retrieve it later using the variable name. And so what it does from a computer standpoint is it goes into the memory of the computer and actually sets aside a little bit of space every time you create the variable. Now there are going to be some naming rules. We're going to use our camel case here. Again, it's not required. It is a preferred programming concept when we name our variables. And the command we're going to give to set up a variable is we're going to use the command var. And var will create the variable, and right after var you're going to give it the name of the variable space. So we might name a variable first name. We might set up a var, this is your GPA. Again, we can make these things up. And the more descriptive they are, the better variable names they are, because when you write code and you're in it, you're like, oh, I know what that means right now, but if you go back to the same code 6 months later, if you've not really named your variables very well, you'll have to spend a lot of time figuring out what your code's doing and what those variables are. So you want to avoid things like var x and var y because they're really not descriptive of what type of data is going to be stored in there and how it's going to be used. Now some naming rules for variables in JavaScript. First of all, you can't have spaces. Notice I used my camel case here with this is your GPA, but it is all smushed together. If you do var this space is space your space GPA, that actually sets up multiple variables and would cause problems down the road if you thought it was all the same thing. The other thing you have to do is make sure that your variables start with a letter. They can contain things like underscores. So I could have var this is your GPA, and that would be an acceptable variable name, those spaces, but the underscore emulating a space is acceptable, but you don't want to start a variable name with a number or with one of those special characters. And the last thing that you don't want to do is don't want to use some of the reserved words as documents. So anything that's part of the programming language, and starting out it might be hard to know, but it's unlikely you would pick one, but you wouldn't want to do something like var document, because as we all know, that's one of the main objects we've used to this point. You also want to avoid things like var write, because that's one of the methods we've used. So what you want to do is choose descriptive variables. You want to follow the rules of naming variables, and again, you want to try to remember to use that camel case naming convention if possible. It just makes it easier for you to read. So one other thing you can do is you can start out with a value. You can say var, and let's say my fave color. I can set that equal to something from the very beginning. So what the browser will do in this case is it'll create the storage space, name it my fave color, and then we'll put this value in. Remember the difference between literal and numeric. If you put literal, in other words, if you use words, you're going to go ahead and put them into double quotes. But if I had something that actually was going to be maybe used in math, like var the tax rate, when I put that equal to something, I really want to be careful to not put it into those double quotes, because I will be using that probably to calculate tax at some point in that example there. So what you really need to know here is variables store places or store things and allow you to retrieve them later. So why I mentioned this is because going back to our prompt up here, what I said is that the minute this goes away, we have a problem, because that information that the person typed in doesn't get stored anywhere. So what we're going to do with the prompt is we're going to set up a variable. We're going to name it first name, and we're going to set it equal to that programming statement. And so when the browser sees this, it puts the prompt up with your two extra little pieces of information instructing them what kind of information to enter. They click OK, and it gets assigned or stored to the variable first name. So what we can do later on is we can document.write, or we can alert and use first name to display that information back to them. So that's the first little example we're going to do, is we're going to grab some information from them, and then we're going to write it back to them. So let me go ahead and get rid of this stuff. Let me go back to the code view. And it doesn't matter where we put this. We can put it in the head section, or we can put it at the beginning of the body section. I'm just going to go ahead and put it in the head section. Open up my script tag. And go ahead and close that script tag. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a variable, and I'm going to name it first name. And I'm going to set that equal to the prompt, and I'm going to ask them to please enter your first name. All right, so they'll enter their first name, they'll click OK. That information that they put in will be stored in that new variable. So let's go ahead and create another one. Let's do var last name. Let's go ahead and prompt them for that as well. So we're going to prompt, please enter your last name. Now I'm going to go ahead and put that second option for the value of what goes in the text box just to show you what it looks like when we run it. And that, I'm sorry, I need to close those quotes first, don't I? And then I'm going to go ahead and say enter last name here. So that should actually show up in the text box. All right, so at this point, all we've done, if they've followed directions, is gathered their first name and their last name and stored them into these variables. So let's actually do something with them. Let's go ahead and write one more line of code. We're going to do an alert. Remember, that's window.alert. And we're going to concatenate a string that allows us to say welcome to the page and then put in their first and last name. So we're going to personalize it for them. So we're going to say welcome, if I can type, that's what it's going to say, welcome to the page. We're going to say comma, and we're going to hit a space so we get our spacing right. And we're going to plus sign in our variable name. So in this case, we're going to do first name, and then we're also going to plus sign, concatenate in whatever stored in last name. Notice these things are not in quotes. If we put them in quotes, it would be taken as a literal value, and it would say welcome to the page, first name, last name. That's not what we want it to do. What we want the program to do is go retrieve what's stored in first name and fill it in. Same thing, retrieve what's in last name and fill it in. So I have a problem here though. Remember how I said spacing is very important here? I had to put that space in so there was space between that comma and the beginning of their first name. Well, we have a similar problem here. First name, so if I typed in my first name, Leah, when it went to concatenate on last name, it's going to put the S of Schultz right up against the H of my first name. So we actually have to do something that seems a little clunky, is we actually have to force the spacing in that we want. So I'm going to add a little bit more to this line of code. I'm going to say plus, I'm going to do quote space quote, because I literally want it to put in a space. Just like we told it to literally put in welcome to the page, comma, space, I'm going to literally tell it to put a space after the first name, and then I'm going to put another plus sign in. I've lost my keyboard for some reason. I'm going to put another plus sign in to have it add my last name. So it runs, we prompt them for their first name, stores in that variable. We prompt them for their last name, it stores in that variable. We throw up an alert saying welcome to the page, fill in what's in first name, fill in what's in what's stored in last name. So let's go ahead and give it a whirl. Let's preview it in Firefox. So when the page comes up, here's our prompt. Notice, please enter your first name. Because we didn't use that second option, the text box is empty. So I'm going to go ahead and enter my first name. I click OK. It asks me for my last name. Notice here is that option where it tells you to enter your last name here. I enter Schultz. I click OK, and it says, welcome to the page, Leah Schultz. And that's what we wanted it to do. I want to show you some problems that might go along with this. Remember I said way back in the beginning that all of this was case sensitive. And one reason I encourage you to get in the habit of doing this camel case is because you don't have to remember, oh, did I capitalize that? Did I not capitalize it? I can't remember. If you always follow a pattern, you know what you did. So let me just show you some things that might happen. Let's say I didn't follow camel case and I did all lowercase. I did var first name prompt. What's going to happen, I mean, it's still going to work, we're just not going to have the output that we expect. They're going to enter their name and it's going to store it in this variable. But when we go to actually welcome them to the page, the program or the browser that's running the program is going to think that this is a different variable than this because of that capital N. So let me show you how that works. I'm going to run it again with that little change, knowingly putting an error in it. So again, I enter my first name, sounds good, enter my last name, yay, my program's working. I get to the output and I don't get output. One of the things that happens when the program shuts down like this is that it doesn't give the expected output and it doesn't give you errors. It does hide errors from your user, which can be a good and a bad thing. And so what I'm going to do, and this is in Firefox, and there are different ways to find it in the different browsers, but all three of the major browsers have something similar to this, is I go to the menu over here, and I can go to the developer menu, and one thing I can do is go to the debugger. And what it's going to do, hopefully, is go to, I'm not sure why it's not showing me my error because we all know I have one. Let me reload it and see if that might be the case. Okay, so we enter our name and it's still not going to show us where our errors are. Debugger. I'm not sure why it's there. Okay, we actually go back to the console. So I was on the wrong button. If you go back to the main console, and like I said, this differs a little bit from browser to browser. I'm not normally a user of Firefox. But here's our console. It gives us our error here. It says first capital NAME is not defined. And it tells me that the problem is in Untitled 2, which is the name of the document I'm working with. And then it says colon and it has 7. And the reason I wanted to point that out is because that's the line number that I mentioned earlier when I told you why I was using Dreamweaver. So if I go back to Dreamweaver and look at line 7, it's going to show me where the variable is that's causing the problem. And so if I were debugging this, I would look at it and say, well, that's a valid name, so there's not a problem there. And if it's undefined, that means I probably messed up on the var statement. So what I would do is I would go back and look where I defined it, and I'd look at that, and I'd look at that, and hopefully I would look at it long enough to where I figured out that I indeed had messed up and changed the case of that. So that right there is an example of how you can get stuff from somebody using the prompt. What we're going to do now is we're going to go over another way that we can get information from a user from a form. So I'm going to delete the script that we just set up. Even though we'll reuse most of it, it won't hurt us to type it again and see it being written again. But I'm going to pop over to the design view real quick because I'm going to create a real quick form. I'm going to insert the form. And on the form, I'm going to insert a text field. I'm going to give it an ID of form first name. And I'm going to click OK. And it somehow managed to get outside of my form. And I'm going to go ahead and insert a button. And I'm going to actually not have it submit the form. I'm going to do just like we did in our previous examples. I'm going to click on it. I'm going to leave it saying submit, but I'm going to change the action from submit form to none. And so what we're going to do on this form is we're going to have them enter their first name. Same concept really. And when they click the submit button, we're going to have an alert button come up and an alert message come up and say, welcome to the page, Leah. So what we need to worry about is getting to this form or I'm sorry, this field right here. And if you remember the lecture a couple of lectures ago about the document object model, the way we're going to do this is we're going to drill down through the hierarchy to get to the value property of this text box. And so what we need to know is we need to know all of the names of the elements that are here. So we know that the window is the top of it, and inside the window is the document. So we got window and we have document. So we know that's as far as we've gotten. What we need to do then is tell it to go to this form. I didn't give this form a name when I created it, but Dreamweaver automatically gives it a name of Form 1, which is fine for our purposes, but you do need to know that it did give it a name of Form 1. You can see that down here, and we'll see it in the code a bit. And then we gave it, our form field, the name of Form First Name. So if we want to get at that value, or when somebody types something in this form, it is stored in the value property of window dot document dot form 1, which is the instance of the form object, dot form first name, which is the instance of our text box, dot value. Okay, that's the property. So let's go switch on over to our code view, and we can see this a little bit better in the code view. Here's our form, automatically named Form 1 by Dreamweaver for us. We can change that if we want to. And then we put in our first name. We have an input type of text with our name of Form First Name. So what we can do is come up to the head section of the document. Let's go ahead and actually, let's do this on click of the button. That was my intent in the first place. So let's say on click is equal to, now this is where it gets tricky. We're going to alert, and we're going to say welcome to our page. Remember, we just used double quotes to set up the on-click event, so we have to use single quotes. And we're going to say welcome to the page, comma. We're going to close that single quote, and we're going to concatenate on. Now, since we're limited to one line of code here in the on-click, we don't really have the ability to store a variable. Later on, I'll show you how to store these things in a variable, but we don't really need a variable here, because what we could do is we can concatenate on that statement that goes through the entire hierarchy of the document object model. So we can say window, which is understood. If you want to type it, knock yourself out, but time is money. So if you type window too many times, you're wasting money and time. So we're going to say document dot form 1 dot form first name dot value. And that is a property, so it doesn't have those parentheses, but we do need to close the quote, we do need to close the parentheses of the alert method and then close our double quotes of the on-click attribute. So the way this works is, as usual, it prints out our welcome to the page, and then it concatenates what it finds from this next part. It tells the browser, go to the document, go find a form on there named Form 1. Somewhere on Form 1, you're going to find something named Form. Looks I have a typo there. So Form First Name, which is our text box, and then retrieve the value property from that and print it out. So let's take a peek. I won't be surprised if I have an error here, but let's see. So I go here, I type my name, I click submit, and it says welcome to the page, Leah. So this is two examples of how we can get information from the user. Realistically, a lot of times the form is the more common way instead of the prompt, but it did allow us to set up the use of variables, which we will use in most of the upcoming programs we do. So I'm going to go ahead and close that down, and in the next section what we're going to do is we're going to go over functions, which will allow us to have as many lines in that on-click event as we want, and also control when and where our code runs.